The glass of champagne trembled in my hand as I overheard my future daughter-in-law laugh and say, I ruined the vibe. Still, I didn't react, just set the flute down on the tray, steady as ever. As the cold condensation clung to my fingers, her words echoed, sharper than the bubbles rising in the glass. While I stood there draped in gold, I realized it wasn't the chill that stunned me. It was her audacity. The same coldness I felt from her smile mirrored what I'd feared. I was never meant to belong. That's when I decided, if I ruin the vibe, I'll also erase her name from my legacy. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden sheen over the smooth, endless stretch of beach. Caroline Masters walked down the soft sand, her gold silk dress trailing like a whisper behind her, catching the light with every step. She had arrived early, a habit she'd never shaken from her days of etiquette training. Always early, always poised. She had promised Eli she would help with whatever was needed before the guests arrived, and she intended to keep her word. The event was meant to be an extravagant affair, a beachfront engagement party with towering floral arrangements, a string quartet playing in the background, and champagne flowing like a river. The sound of the waves crashing softly on the shore made the whole thing feel almost surreal, like a dream framed in a perfect moment. Caroline approached the small gathering of early arrivals with a calm smile, noting the intricacies of the setup. Chairs perfectly aligned, the long white linen tables gleaming under the lights. It was beautiful, of course, but the meticulous design of the event was secondary. What mattered was her son, Eli, his happiness, and his fiancée, Tara. Caroline spotted Tara near the edge of the deck, talking to the caterers, her back turned. She hesitated before approaching. There was a stiffness in the air, something Caroline couldn't shake. An invisible wall between them that had grown with each passing month since Tara entered their lives. Tara had made it clear from the beginning that Caroline's presence wasn't entirely welcome, but the silence between them had become deafening. "Can I help with anything?" Caroline asked, her voice light, warm. Too warm, perhaps, in contrast to the coolness she felt emanating from Tara. She was trying, as always, to bridge the gap, to be supportive. But it never seemed to work. Tara turned, her lips barely curving upward in what might have been a smile. "No, I've got it," she said, her voice clipped and dismissive. "You can just enjoy the view, I guess." The words hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Caroline's smile faltered but remained in place. She nodded politely and moved away, retreating to the periphery of the gathering where Eli was chatting with a few of his friends. She could feel the weight of Tara's coldness like an anchor pulling at her chest, but she kept her posture straight, her demeanor unshaken. Eli was distracted, as usual, half listening, half lost in his thoughts. He gave her a brief smile when she approached, but didn't really acknowledge her presence. She could sense the way he was caught between worlds. His loyalty to Tara, the excitement of his engagement, and the quiet pull of his mother's legacy that still wrapped around him like a comforting embrace, even though he rarely spoke of it anymore. "I'm glad you could make it, Mom," he said, his tone polite but distant, as if checking a box on a list. Caroline smiled again, her expression softening. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied, though something in her gut twisted, a growing sense of alienation that was harder to ignore with every passing moment. As the evening progressed, Tara began to circulate among the guests, posing for pictures, flashing her perfectly polished smile. Caroline stayed in the background, watching, observing, ever the silent observer in a room where she had never quite felt at home. She noticed how Tara positioned herself in every photo, always front and center, making sure she was the focus of the camera's lens. And every time, Tara made sure Caroline was out of the frame, subtly shifting her body, positioning herself in such a way that Caroline's face was always just out of view. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. The worst of it came when she overheard Tara talking to one of her friends, her voice low, but the words clearly cutting through the soft music playing in the background. Ugh. Her energy totally ruins the vibe. The words stung more than Caroline expected. Her energy. She repeated them in her mind as though trying to understand what Tara meant. Energy? What exactly had she done to ruin the vibe? Had it been her age? Her quiet dignity? Or was it simply that she, Caroline Masters, did not fit into Tara's glittering world of wealth and status? Caroline's smile froze in place, the warmth draining from her face in an instant. She didn't need to hear the rest. She knew what she had to do. Without another word, she turned and left. She didn't need to make a scene, didn't need to confront anyone. She was beyond that now. She was done. She didn't wait for Eli to notice, didn't wait for anyone to acknowledge her departure. She simply walked away, her gold silk dress flowing behind her like a trail of unspoken defiance. The night air felt cooler against her skin as she made her way back to the car, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses growing fainter with every step. By the time she reached the parking lot, her smile had completely vanished. She wasn't just hurt, she was angry. Angry at Tara's cruelty, angry at Eli's indifference, and above all, angry at herself for ever thinking she could be part of this world, this shallow display of everything she wasn't. But one thing was clear. The vibe she had supposedly ruined? It was nothing compared to the storm she was about to bring. The game had only just begun, and Tara had no idea what she was truly up against. The following morning, Caroline stood in front of the mirror, the weight of the previous evening still heavy on her shoulders. The gold silk dress had long since been folded away, but the sharp memory of Tara's words. Her energy totally ruins the vibe, cut deeper than any fabric. She didn't need to relive it. The sting still lingered in the corners of her mind, a constant reminder of what she'd been made to feel. But as the sun rose higher and the promise of another day beckoned, a calmness settled over her. She wasn't going to waste any more time on the trivialities of Tara's cruelty. Today, Caroline would start her work, the work that would ensure her place and her legacy were never in question. She called Marla, her trusted lawyer, and set an appointment for the morning. Caroline arrived at Marla's office just before noon, a gleaming glass tower that looked down over Naples's pristine waterfront. Inside, the office felt cool and neutral, the kind of space where nothing was left to chance, where decisions about wealth, power, and family legacies were made with careful deliberation. It was here that Caroline had always felt a sense of control, a sharp contrast to the emotional chaos that had taken over her life in recent months. Marla greeted her with a tight smile, her expression unreadable, as usual. There were no pleasantries, no questions about how Caroline had slept or how she was feeling. Marla knew better than to waste time with the small talk. She gestured to the sleek chair opposite her desk, a professional distance between them, and Caroline sank into it. "I don't need to tell you why I'm here," Caroline began, her voice low but steady. The sharpness in her tone carried the weight of all the years of patience, control, and quiet observation that had finally come to a head. Tara's influence over Eli is only growing. I saw it last night. Felt it. If she's this controlling now, imagine what she'll be like when she has actual power. She's already making decisions about the future. And they're not just about Eli. She's using him to stake her claim on everything I've built. Marla didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her expression pragmatic, professional. "You're not overreacting. You're acting ahead. It's smart, really. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to protect yourself and your estate." Caroline felt a flicker of relief, as though she were finally hearing the words she'd needed to hear. She wasn't just being paranoid. She wasn't the one out of touch. Tara was dangerous, and Caroline had every right to be concerned. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together in front of her. "I want to restructure the trust," she said, her voice firm. "I want to make sure Eli's inheritance is protected, and that Tara can't worm her way into it. I want her to understand that there are boundaries, and if she pushes too far, she'll lose everything." Marla's eyes flickered with something Caroline could almost mistake for approval. "We can do that. We can structure it in a way that will be difficult for anyone to challenge. But you need to be clear on what you want to do, and how much control you're willing to give up." Caroline's mind was already racing through the possibilities. She'd spent decades building her wealth, her legacy, the estate, the investments, everything she'd worked for. It all had to be protected. And Eli, her only son, needed to understand that his future wasn't just about the woman he was marrying, it was about something far larger than that. "I want conditions," Caroline said, her voice low and deliberate. "If Eli marries without a prenup, there's no inheritance, no exceptions." Marla nodded again. "You're clear-headed, Caroline. That's good." Caroline's gaze hardened, the full extent of her resolve setting in. "It's not just about money, it's about principle. Tara needs to understand that she's not entitled to everything just because she's wearing a ring." As the conversation deepened, Caroline heard a soft knock at the door. It was Dahlia, her goddaughter, carrying a tray of coffee for them both. Dahlia was quiet, observant, never one to intrude, but Caroline could see the concern in her eyes as she entered. She placed the coffee down with a soft smile before lingering for a moment, as if unsure whether to stay. Caroline caught her gaze and offered a small, appreciative nod. Dahlia had always been the quiet strength in her life, the one person who never wavered in her support. Caroline could tell, even without words, that Dahlia understood what was happening, and was silently backing her every step of the way. "I'll leave you both to it," Dahlia murmured, before stepping quietly out of the office. Caroline's eyes followed Dahlia's retreating figure, her heart warming for a moment before the harsh reality of the situation set back in. This wasn't just about her legacy anymore. It was about control, about power, about ensuring that no one would ever be able to erase her, to rewrite her story. Caroline turned back to Marla. "Let's move quickly. I want everything in place before Tara has a chance to make her next move." Marla's fingers hovered over her tablet as she began taking notes. "I'll start drafting the documents. We'll make sure the changes are bulletproof." Caroline stood up, her posture now one of unshakable determination. "And when she tries to fight me, when she sees that she's lost everything, I want her to know exactly who she's up against." As she walked out of the office, the world outside seemed to blur for a moment. It wasn't just about the wealth anymore. It was about sending a message. Caroline had been underestimated for far too long. Tara had no idea what she was about to awaken. And when the storm hit, it would be too late for anyone to stop it. The glass doors of the private banking office slid open with a soft whoosh, and Caroline stepped inside, the cool air conditioning cutting through the warmth of the late morning sun. The marble floors gleamed underfoot, reflecting the sharp lines of the modern furnishings. It was a place designed to make one feel small, to remind you that power and wealth were not just numbers, but systems. Carefully curated, tightly controlled. Jonas Perez stood by the massive windows, his back turned as he looked out over the glittering waters of Naples Bay. He was a man who seemed to understand the language of money as well as anyone, but it was his ability to make money silent that always impressed Caroline. No words were wasted in his world. Every move was deliberate, every decision calculated. Caroline didn't need to greet him. He heard her approach and turned smoothly, his expression already shifting into something professional, expectant. "Good morning," Jonas said, his voice steady and calm. He gestured to the sleek glass table where a few documents were neatly stacked. "I've prepared the preliminary figures. We'll go over Eli's stake and what you'd like to do next." Caroline nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just a financial move. This was the beginning of her reclamation. She wasn't simply protecting her wealth. She was ensuring that no one, especially Tara, would be able to bend the future to their will without consequence. She took her seat at the table, her hands steady as she flipped through the documents. A simple glance at the first page was enough to confirm what she already suspected. The trust was fully revocable. Eli had the power to access everything, as long as he stayed unmarried or fulfilled whatever minimal expectations had been set. "It's all too malleable," Caroline murmured, the realization settling heavily on her. Eli's inheritance, his future. It could all disappear in an instant if Tara has her way. Jonas sat down across from her, folding his hands in front of him. His eyes met hers, unwavering, his calm demeanor never changing. "It's a risk you've been aware of for years, Caroline. The language is flexible, as it was meant to be. But we can restructure it. We can lock everything down, make it bulletproof." Caroline's jaw tightened. "Then let's do that. I won't let someone like her stake a claim on everything I've worked for." Jonas nodded, pulling a separate set of papers from the stack. His fingers moved quickly across the pages, scanning the terms and conditions that had already been drafted. "We'll begin by moving the high-value assets into conditional-only trusts. That'll place them beyond reach unless certain conditions are met. Conditions that won't be easily bypassed." Caroline leaned forward, her eyes sharp as she scanned the documents. "What conditions?" Jonas's eyes twinkled with the understanding that came with decades in the financial world. "We can add clauses that specify Eli's inheritance is conditional on a prenuptial agreement. Without it, there's no claim to anything." He paused, letting the weight of the suggestion sink in. "We'll make sure Tara knows she doesn't have the leverage she thinks she does. Not now. Not ever." Caroline's lips pressed together, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This was it. This was the moment where she took back control, where her legacy would be secured, and where Tara's audacity would be met with a wall of unyielding boundaries. "I want those clauses in place immediately," Caroline said, her voice steady, firm. "No prenup, no inheritance, and we make sure Eli understands the consequences too." Jonas nodded again, his face unreadable as he made quick notations on his tablet. "Understood. It'll be airtight. We'll make sure that Tara has no recourse if she tries to contest it." Caroline sat back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table, almost as if she could feel the weight of the decision pressing down into the polished wood. This wasn't about money, not anymore. This was about respect. This was about Tara learning that she wasn't the center of the universe, that there were laws and boundaries that could not be crossed, no matter how many Instagram followers one had or how loud one's voice was at a cocktail party. "What happens next?" Caroline asked, her gaze fixed on Jonas. "We file the changes and make sure they're locked in before the wedding. We'll also need Eli's signature, of course," Jonas replied, tapping a few more commands into his device. "Once it's in place, it's irrevocable. No one can undo it." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "I want Eli to know exactly what's at stake. This isn't just about him. This is about me and everything I've built. Tara will never be able to touch it." There was a brief pause as Jonas absorbed her words. Then he nodded, clearly understanding the depth of what she was asking. "You'll get the protection you need, and the message will be clear." Caroline stood up, smoothing her dress with a quick motion, her posture straight and resolute. She wasn't just ready for the fight ahead. She had already won the first round. The documents would be finalized, the trust would be locked down, and Tara would realize soon enough that Caroline Masters had no intention of letting anyone, erase her from the narrative of her own life. As Caroline turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass doors. She was ready. She was unstoppable. And as she walked out of the office, the world seemed just a little bit smaller. One more move in place, and it was checkmate. Caroline stood before the mirror, her reflection bathed in the soft light of the fitting room. The silk fabric glimmered like liquid gold, the kind of hue that demanded attention without shouting. It was elegant, graceful, yet bold in a way that could never be mistaken for demure. The dress had been designed with intention. Every stitch a message, every fold a declaration. This was no ordinary piece of clothing, it was armor. The tailor adjusted the hem, smoothing it over Caroline's heels, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already miles ahead, thinking of the dinner, the invitation she had crafted with precision, the tone she would set. Tara would have her engagement party, her perfect little world. But tonight, it would be Caroline's turn to make her presence felt. As she turned to admire the silhouette, the door to the fitting room opened and Dahlia stepped inside. The young woman's eyes widened as she took in the sight of Caroline in the dress, the quiet reverence she always carried in her gaze now tinged with something like awe. "You look like a warning," Dahlia said softly, her voice almost reverent. She was perched in the doorway holding a small box of jewelry that had been carefully selected to complement the dress. Caroline turned slightly, eyes meeting Dahlia's in the mirror. "That's the idea," she replied, her voice calm but steady. As if the very thought of Tara's intrusion, of everything Tara had already stolen, was more than she could bear. The dress was the statement, the invitation was the weapon. Tonight was more than just a rehearsal dinner, it was a reckoning. She had been patient, dignified, quiet in the background, but no longer. Tara would understand the true meaning of power when Caroline was finished. The evening arrived with a crisp edge to the air, a cool breeze rolling off the water and dancing through the perfectly manicured grounds of Caroline's estate. The courtyard was decorated with soft lights, flowers arranged meticulously in towering arrangements, and delicate glassware catching the light from the candles placed strategically across the tables. Caroline had spared no expense. This night would be unforgettable. As the first guests trickled in, Caroline stood at the entrance, her gold dress shimmering like an omen. She greeted each person with a smile that bordered on cold, her demeanor poised, every inch the epitome of elegance and control. Marla, her lawyer, was the first to arrive, dressed in a tailored suit, her expression a mask of professionalism that matched Caroline's. "You're quite the sight, Caroline," Marla said, her lips curling into a small, approving smile. "I must admit, I wasn't sure you'd go this far." Caroline's eyes sparkled, but her expression remained unreadable. "It's not about going far, Marla," she replied, her voice steady. "It's about sending a message." As the last of the guests filed in, the tension in the air shifted. Caroline could feel it. The eyes of the crowd, the subtle whispers, the undercurrent of expectation. She had already won, and the evening hadn't even truly begun. Dahlia lingered nearby, her eyes scanning the crowd. Her support was quiet, but Caroline could feel it with every passing moment. The girl had always understood the weight of her decisions, even when the world around her couldn't. There was a quiet power in Dahlia's presence that made Caroline feel a flicker of warmth in her chest. Then, just as the conversation started to pick up, Tara appeared, elegant in a form-fitting dress of her own, but there was no mistaking the difference. While Tara's dress gleamed with a superficial sheen, Caroline's gold caught the light in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. Tara's eyes flickered over Caroline for a fraction of a second before she plastered on a smile, walking toward her. The tension between them was palpable. like the calm before a storm. "I thought you were hosting a dinner, not a fashion show," Tara said, her voice saccharine sweet but edged with an undeniable bite. Caroline's smile didn't waver. "I'm hosting both, actually," she replied, her words so poised they felt like a threat. Before Tara could respond, Eli appeared behind her, his face showing the slightest hint of concern. "Mom, is this really necessary?" His voice was low, laced with discomfort. His eyes flicked between Caroline and Tara, unsure of how to navigate the storm that was about to break. Caroline's gaze softened as she turned to him. "Eli, darling, this is just one night," she said, her voice smooth, almost indulgent. "And sometimes it's the most uncomfortable moments that reveal the truth." Tara, ever the one to demand attention, was clearly unamused, her jaw tightening as she exchanged a glance with Eli. But Caroline could see the shift in her demeanor. Tara was already calculating how to regain control, how to pull Eli back to her side. Caroline knew exactly how the game would unfold, and she was ready for it. She raised her glass, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "Tonight, I want to welcome everyone and remind you that this evening is not just about celebrating engagements, but about celebrating transparency. A value I hold dearly." A collective pause filled the room. Tara's eyes flashed with annoyance, but Caroline couldn't help the small flicker of satisfaction that curled inside her. Tara had already made her missteps, already set herself up to lose. The evening was far from over. Caroline had set the stage. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, the realization starting to creep through the room. Tara's little world, the one she thought she controlled, was about to be shattered. And as much as Eli might want to pretend to navigate this carefully, there was no way around it. Tonight, Caroline's legacy would shine brighter than anything Tara could ever hope to grasp. But Tara was far from done, and neither was Caroline. The first move had been made. The gold dress was only the beginning. The oceanfront patio shimmered in the twilight, the soft rhythm of the waves creating a backdrop to the elegant chaos that was unfolding before Caroline. The space was bathed in warm golden light, strands of fairy lights hanging from the towering palms, casting delicate shadows on the carefully arranged tables. Each seat was placed with precision, silverware polished to perfection, and crystal glasses gleaming in the soft glow of the candles that flickered in their stems. The night was supposed to be a celebration, a toast to the future, but Caroline knew better. Tonight was the beginning of the end for Tara's carefully constructed facade. Guests had already begun to mingle, the hum of polite conversation floating through the air, punctuated by laughter and clinking glasses. Caroline stood on the edge of it all for a moment, taking in the scene, her posture upright, her gaze fixed, unyielding. She had already won, and the evening was still young. She wasn't the first to arrive, but that had always been her style. There was power in arriving last. And when Caroline stepped onto the patio, it was as if the entire scene had been paused for just a heartbeat. Heads turned as her gold silk dress seemed to catch every ray of light, reflecting a kind of confidence, a timeless elegance that demanded attention. With Marla at her side, as always, poised and composed, Carolyn walked into the room with a calm, steady grace. She was the picture of authority, poised yet purposeful, every inch of her a declaration that she was in control. The reaction from the guests was subtle at first. A slight hesitation, a murmured exchange, a quiet ripple of admiration that only grew louder the longer she stood there. The dress was magnificent, like liquid gold, the kind of bold statement Tara would never have dared to wear. But Caroline wasn't trying to outshine anyone. No, her purpose tonight was far more precise. This was not about fashion. This was about legacy, power, and making sure no one could ever forget who was really in charge. Tara, standing by the edge of the crowd with a glass of champagne, had been watching from the moment Caroline entered, and her face betrayed the discomfort that bubbled beneath the surface. The corners of her mouth twitched into a thin smile as she strode over to Caroline, but it was tight, forced, a reflection of the animosity that had been brewing for months. "Is this necessary?" Tara's words were a soft challenge, barely above a whisper, yet they carried with them an edge that pierced through the moment. Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't look Tara's way directly, but instead allowed the question to hang in the air for a moment before she responded. "This is a celebration, Tara," Caroline replied smoothly, her voice like silk over steel. "And I do so love to celebrate family." The tension between them was palpable, but Caroline held her ground, her posture unwavering. She was playing the long game, and she knew that tonight, the message had to be clear. This was her world, not Tara's. The conversation died as Caroline made her way to the center of the patio, where a small stage had been set up for speeches and toasts. Marla was by her side, her presence a reminder of the quiet, calculated strength that had been behind every decision Caroline had made in the past few days. The air shifted once more as Caroline took the mic, the crowd falling silent, the soft murmur of waves now competing with the stillness that had settled over the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline began, her voice clear and steady, carrying effortlessly across the space. The eyes of every guest were now on her. The whispers died down, replaced by anticipation. "Thank you for being here tonight, for celebrating the future of my son and his fiancée." Her words were formal, almost too perfect, and she paused just long enough to let the tension thicken. "But tonight," Caroline continued, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, "I'd like to offer a toast not just to the happy couple, but to something much more important: transparency." The word hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Caroline raised her glass, allowing the silence to linger a moment longer before she handed the microphone to Marla. Marla, ever the professional, took the mic without missing a beat, her eyes meeting Caroline's for a brief moment before turning back to the crowd. "I've been asked to speak to the family's future," Marla said, her voice calm and precise, "and to ensure that certain matters are made clear, once and for all." Caroline's gaze never wavered from Tara's, whose face had turned a shade paler under the weight of what was unfolding. Marla's voice cut through the heavy silence. "To protect family values, Caroline's estate and inheritance are conditional. This means, should any marriage occur without a prenuptial agreement, no inheritance shall be granted. No exceptions." There was a collective gasp, a shift in the air. Caroline felt the satisfaction ripple through her, the surge of power at the realization that the ground was shifting beneath Tara's feet. This wasn't just a dinner. This wasn't just an announcement. This was Caroline's declaration of war. Tara's face tightened, her mouth opening to speak, but the words never came. For once, she was rendered speechless. Eli, standing near Tara, glanced between his mother and his fiancée, the tension in his posture signaling the turmoil that was likely brewing inside him. Caroline stood watching the room, her expression unreadable. Her eyes locked on Tara's, watching as the weight of the words settled in. Tara's world was crumbling, piece by piece, right before her eyes. But the game had only just begun. The night had carried on with a quiet undercurrent of tension. As guests made their way to the lavishly decorated tables, the clink of glasses and quiet conversations seemed a world away from the cold exchange that had just transpired. Caroline stood off to the side, her eyes scanning the room with a calm, calculating gaze. Every inch of her posture exuded control. She knew that tonight would change everything for Tara, but the real battle, the one that mattered, was just beginning. The moment Eli found her alone in the garden, he didn't even try to mask the frustration in his eyes. He was angry, His face, once a mirror of politeness and reserved warmth, was now tight, his brow furrowed in disbelief. The calmness that had defined him for years was gone, replaced by the rawness of a son who felt trapped between loyalty and reality. Was that really necessary? Eli's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in it. His fists were clenched at his sides, the tension in his shoulders telling her everything she needed to know about what he was holding back. His gaze flickered to the house, where Tara had disappeared moments before, the storm between them yet to fully break. Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She met his eyes with the same unwavering resolve she had worn throughout the night. "More appropriate than pretending to like me while counting my assets," she replied, her words quiet but unmistakably sharp. The words hung between them, and for a moment, Eli's expression softened, as though the weight of everything was finally sinking in. But he quickly regained control, shifting his weight and crossing his arms, a defensive gesture. His voice cracked with frustration as he spoke again. "Mom, this isn't about assets. This is about Tara and me, our future," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "You can't just treat her like she's the enemy. She's not." Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line, and she took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the stone walkway. "I'm not treating her like the enemy, Eli. I'm protecting what matters, what I built." Her voice softened then, a layer of something much colder underneath. "I'm protecting you too, whether you realize it or not." The space between them was charged, an invisible wall that had slowly been built brick by brick. Eli hesitated, his mind clearly warring between loyalty to the woman he loved and the undeniable truth that his mother had a point. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated again, his words caught somewhere between obligation and resentment. Caroline stepped back, her gaze never leaving his. She had made her position clear. But she knew Eli. She knew how easily he could be swayed by Tara's charms, by the image of the future she'd painted so brilliantly for him. "I'm doing this because I love you, Eli," Caroline said, her voice steady but laced with the kind of finality that left no room for argument. "I've watched your future slip away from you before your very eyes. I've watched you lose yourself in her expectations, and I won't stand by and watch it happen again." For a moment, Eli looked as though he might say something, but before he could, the silence was broken by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. It was Marla, appearing out of the shadows like a silent sentinel. She had been watching from the sidelines. But her presence was the final touch that made the conversation feel even more like a courtroom than a family matter. Marla didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped forward and handed Caroline a sleek folder. The prenup terms, already drafted. Caroline's eyes flickered over the contents, her fingers brushing over the pages as she skimmed the legalese. Everything was in order. Tight. Airtight. There was no way Tara could wriggle out of this one. "This," Marla said, her voice calm and professional as she addressed Eli directly, "is to protect the estate, Eli. Your future. Tara's too, if she's willing to sign it." Eli glanced down at the folder in his hands, his eyes narrowing. "I don't understand. Why is this even necessary, Mom? She loves me. We don't need this contract." Caroline's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "It's not about love, Eli. It's about respect. And understanding that trust isn't built on blind faith but on mutual agreement. I trust you," she said, her voice growing firm. "But I don't trust Tara." His jaw clenched. "Tara isn't the problem. You are." The words cut like ice, and Caroline felt the sting deep in her chest. It wasn't unexpected, but it still hit harder than she anticipated. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the waves lapping gently at the shore. Caroline stood still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze never wavering from Eli's. Her voice was quiet, but unwavering. Decide what matters more, her signature or my estate. Eli's eyes searched her face, his expression a whirlwind of confusion, frustration, and something else, something deeper. He didn't want to face it, but he knew the choice had already been made. His hands shook slightly as he clutched the prenup folder, his fingers nervously tracing the edges. Marla stepped in again, her voice quiet but sharp. "We all have to make hard decisions, Eli. This is one of them." She glanced at Caroline, her face unreadable. "And it's one that can't be undone." The silence between them felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down harder with each passing second. Eli's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. He didn't speak, but his eyes flickered between Caroline and the prenup, the heavy choice now lying squarely in his hands. Caroline's heart thudded in her chest, the final piece falling into place. The war had begun, but this was only the beginning. The day after the rehearsal dinner, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What was once a celebratory air had turned heavy with tension, a pressure Caroline could feel settling into every corner of the house. She had expected resistance, but the wave of it hit harder than she anticipated. Tara's mother, Veronica, arrived unannounced, her presence like a storm cloud rolling over the estate. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that screamed status, Veronica wasted no time in confronting Caroline, her sharp, glistening eyes locked onto Caroline's with an intensity that matched her tone when she spoke. "This is cruel, Caroline," Veronica said, her voice low but full of venom. "What you're doing to my daughter. This is cruel." Caroline didn't flinch. She had been prepared for this. People like Veronica didn't care about the finer points of family history or legacy. They cared about power, money, and control. And in that moment, Caroline realized that protecting her legacy meant standing firm against every pushback, no matter how sharp or biting. Veronica paced slightly, her heels clicking against the marble floors. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Tara?" Her voice grew louder, the irritation seeping through. "She's already giving up everything for your son, and now you're doing this? You're forcing her to sign that?" She waved the prenup folder in the air, her face a mask of outrage. "She's humiliated." Caroline's gaze never wavered. Her posture remained poised, calm. This was her domain. "Tara's feelings are irrelevant in this matter, Veronica," she said, her voice steady but edged with the coldness of resolve. "I've watched this play out too many times in my life to ignore the consequences of a decision like this." Veronica's expression twisted. "This isn't just about money for you, is it? It's control. You want control over everything, even who Eli marries." Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. "What I want is to ensure that my legacy, his legacy, is never jeopardized by someone who can't even be trusted with the truth. The estate I built isn't something to be played with. I won't allow it." Veronica let out a bitter laugh, stepping forward in a deliberate attempt to close the space between them. "You think Tara can't handle it? She's been nothing but good to Eli. You're just using this as an excuse to tear her down." Caroline's expression hardened. She glanced over to where Marla stood, having remained silent so far, a quiet observer. But now, Marla handed Caroline her phone, a quiet communication, and Caroline saw that the email had been sent. "We both know what's been given, Veronica," Caroline said slowly, her gaze narrowing as she addressed the other woman. "I've supported Eli's future. Everything he has today is because of my investment in his future. Tuition, down payments, startup funds for his business. You think I'm cruel? What about the years I spent making sure Eli had every opportunity? Every door opened?" The words felt sharp, slicing through the air between them, and Veronica faltered for just a moment. But she quickly recovered, her face reddening as she tried to regain her footing in this verbal duel. You think that makes you right? She spat, her tone venomous. You think that entitles you to tear apart a family just because you can? Eli doesn't even know how much you've meddled in his life. Caroline's expression remained unfazed. I've never meddled, Veronica. I've simply ensured that my son's future is never at the mercy of someone like Tara. She glanced at the screen of Marla's phone once again. The email had gone through. The documents had been sent. All the financial support, all the transactions, the evidence of how she had made Eli's life possible. Marla, as always, stayed calm, her gaze never leaving Veronica as Caroline continued. I've sent a copy to the family, to Eli. Let him see for himself what's been given, what's been done. Let him see if Tara truly deserves everything she expects. Veronica's face turned a deeper shade of red, her breath coming in sharp bursts. You're ruining everything, Caroline. This wedding, this entire family, is falling apart because of your greed and your pride. Caroline leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Veronica's. No, Veronica. I'm not ruining anything. I'm protecting what I built. You may not understand that, but I've lived long enough to know when someone's trying to take what's mine. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen. At that moment, Tara appeared in the doorway, her face drawn and tight, her posture rigid. Her eyes flickered from Caroline to Veronica, and for the briefest of moments the tension was so thick in the air it felt like it might snap. Tara's voice, when she finally spoke, was cold. You're ruining the wedding, she hissed, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. All this, everything you're doing, you're ruining it. You're driving a wedge between Eli and me. Caroline's gaze locked onto Tara's, and she saw the same arrogance, the same unearned confidence that had made her so dangerous from the start. Tara had always believed she could bend the world to her will, and it was that belief that had made her so dangerous. No, Caroline said, her voice low and calm. I'm protecting what matters, and that's something you'll never understand. Tara opened her mouth to speak again, but Caroline cut her off. You'll sign the prenup, or Eli will make the decision. It's not about love, Tara, it's about trust. And right now, there's nothing about you that inspires trust. Tara's mouth snapped shut, her expression a mix of rage and disbelief. But Caroline didn't back down. She knew that the hardest part, the one that had cost her the most, was already behind her. The choice was now in Eli's hands. But Caroline knew this. No matter what, she would never be erased from the narrative of her own life. Not by Tara, not by anyone. The day of the wedding arrived, and Caroline stood before her mirror one last time, gazing at her reflection. The gold dress she had chosen for this moment was a muted shade of elegance, understated but impossible to ignore. It was the perfect balance, a statement without the need to shout. Soft gold, the kind that shimmered in the right light, but never stole the spotlight. Unlike Tara's flashy gown, this dress spoke with quiet authority. As Caroline adjusted the neckline, Dahlia stepped into the room, her eyes immediately scanning Caroline's outfit with admiration. You're the best dressed here, Dahlia whispered, her voice tinged with a quiet respect that always seemed to follow Caroline's presence. It was a moment of calm in the storm of emotions Caroline had been holding back for days. Thank you, Dahlia, Caroline replied softly, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. She didn't need to say more. Dahlia understood the weight of the evening and the battle that had been fought long before this moment. They left the room, and the walk to the venue was almost surreal. The sun hung low over the ceremony site, casting a soft golden glow on the flowers and the crisp white chairs arranged neatly along the aisle. The sound of the ocean, usually calming, seemed now to hum with the tension that surrounded her every step. Caroline made her way to the front row, where the seat reserved for her was situated directly across from where Tara stood, radiant in her white dress, the glow of the day casting a halo around her. Tara looked as though she belonged there, but Caroline knew better. This wasn't Tara's world. It was Caroline's. As Caroline sat, the world around her seemed to blur. She knew this moment wasn't about the wedding itself. It was about presence. It was about being seen. But she didn't need to interact with Tara to make her presence known. She simply had to be there. Eli stood at the altar, his face tense, but his eyes carefully averted from Caroline's gaze. The space between them had grown, not just physically, but emotionally. Eli had made his decision, and now she had to live with it. Caroline felt the weight of his avoidance in the air, a subtle, almost invisible wall between them. But it wasn't the first time she had been pushed aside for someone else's comfort. It wouldn't be the last. She was accustomed to standing alone in moments like this. The ceremony unfolded in front of her. The vows exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers, the smiles and the promises. But Caroline was distant, her thoughts far away, absorbed in the quiet battle that had been fought in silence, long before this day. She didn't need to applaud. She didn't need to offer a toast. The moment Eli and Tara were pronounced husband and wife, a rush of applause rippled through the crowd, and the scene shifted to the reception. The ballroom glittered with lights, and music filled the air, but Caroline remained still, seated at her table, poised and composed. She hadn't moved. She wasn't going to. The reception began in its usual fashion, filled with speeches, laughter, and the clink of glasses. But when the time came for the customary toast, Caroline stayed silent, her glass untouched. She knew what they expected. An acknowledgement, a blessing of some sort. Perhaps a gesture to show that she was part of the celebration. But she would not offer it. Not this time. Tara's eyes flicked to Caroline's table more than once, but Caroline never met her gaze. Instead, she stayed focused on the quiet conversation Dahlia had initiated beside her. The only toast that mattered would be the one she would give herself, in private. It would be to the victory she had claimed over everything she had built and everything that had tried to tear it down. Later, as the night wore on and the room began to feel warmer, Caroline noticed Tara on the far side of the room, snapping photos with her friends. Caroline's presence was there, looming just behind her, but Tara acted as if she couldn't even see it. And then Caroline caught it. A post, a simple, elegant shot of the bride and groom, framed in sunlight, smiles bright. The caption read, "A perfect day for the perfect couple, nothing else matters." There it was. No mention of Caroline, no acknowledgement of the woman who had built this life, this family. Tara had done what she always did, erased Caroline from the picture. Just like that. But Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't need to be in the frame. She was already more than that. As the evening wore on and the final notes of the wedding song echoed in the distance, Caroline felt an odd sense of peace settle in. The world around her had tried to minimize her, to box her in, but tonight had been another quiet reminder that no one could ever erase the truth of what she had created, of what she was. And as Tara posted another picture, her smile wide and proud, Caroline allowed herself a small, satisfied smile of her own. She had made her statement. She had fought for what mattered. And in the end, no Instagram post, no staged photo would ever change that. The house was quieter now. The hum of post-wedding excitement had faded, leaving only the sound of distant waves and the occasional murmur of voices. Caroline had spent the day in a daze, her mind running over the events of the previous evening like a loop, replaying every moment, every glance from Eli, every word Tara had uttered. She had made her statement. But the most important part, the part that would secure her legacy, was yet to come. The next morning, Caroline sat in her office staring at the screen in front of her. The calm exterior she maintained was simply a veneer. Beneath it, there was a storm brewing, the final pieces of her strategy falling into place. The assets that Tara thought were hers, the life that Tara had believed she was entitled to, were locked behind unbreakable barriers. Caroline's phone buzzed on the desk. It was Jonas, her trusted bank officer, and his message was short but loaded with meaning. Everything's done. The timing was perfect. It's locked. A small, satisfied smile tugged at Caroline's lips. The plan had gone off without a hitch. Everything was in place. All assets moved into conditional trusts. Tara would have no claim to a penny unless she met the terms Caroline had set. The beauty of the system lay in its simplicity. No prenup, no inheritance. The stakes were high, and Tara had no idea what she had just stepped into. Minutes later, Caroline was in her study, staring at the series of accounts she had quietly monitored for weeks. She had anticipated Tara's next move. The woman had always been determined to be in control, but control over what? Money? Power? Eli's future? Caroline would make sure Tara had none of it. At least, none of it unless she met the conditions Caroline had set. Tara had always thought she could simply join this life, step into it as if it were already hers. Caroline was about to make sure that Tara would never have that privilege. Caroline's fingers hovered over the keyboard, bringing up the login screen for the shared accounts between Eli and Tara. She knew what was about to happen. Tara would try to take control, to stake her claim on the wealth and the power that had once been within her grasp. And she was right. Tara, now married, approached the accounts with the same entitled confidence, her fingers tapping rapidly at the keys, her eyes narrowing with the certainty that this was all hers now. She clicked through, expecting to access the vast reserves that Caroline had built, expecting to see everything fall into her hands like it was meant to. But instead, a cold realization began to settle in as the system locked her out. Repeatedly. Tara's fingers grew tense as she tried again, her face growing more and more frustrated. There was no access to the accounts, no direct control. She had no way in. The message that appeared on the screen was simple, blunt. Access denied. Conditional trusts in place. Tara slammed her hand against the desk in disbelief, her breath coming in shallow, angry bursts. Her eyes darted over to Eli, sitting quietly at the other side of the room, scrolling through his phone, blissfully unaware. Tara's mind raced. She hadn't been told about any trusts. She hadn't been informed about any restrictions. But now, her face flushed with the unmistakable feeling of power slipping from her grasp. "Eli!" Tara hissed, her voice low and controlled, despite the building fury inside her. "What is this? What the hell is going on with these accounts?" Eli looked up, his face perplexed. He had no idea what she was talking about, and for a moment, his confusion was almost palpable. But then, slowly, something seemed to dawn on him. The tension in his shoulders tightened as he looked at his phone again, then back to Tara. "I don't know," he muttered, his tone distant. "I haven't even looked at them." Tara shot up from her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. "Well, I can't access them. Why is this happening?" Before Eli could respond, the door opened, and Caroline walked in, her expression cool and calm, almost serene. She glanced at Tara, who was now standing, her face red with frustration. "What's happening, Tara?" Caroline asked, her voice soft, but edged with purpose. Tara was about to lash out, but something in Caroline's calm demeanor held her back. Her gaze flickered to Eli, searching for some kind of support, but his eyes remained evasive, unwilling to meet hers. Caroline, reading the situation clearly, stepped closer. Her heels clicking sharply against the floor, every inch of her poised, every motion deliberate. "I've set up conditional trusts. All of Eli's assets are tied to them. If you want access to them, you'll have to meet the terms," she explained, her voice controlled but full of finality. Tara's face paled as the weight of Caroline's words began to sink in. She opened her mouth to protest, to demand access, to challenge the terms, but Caroline was already prepared for this moment. She turned toward the screen, where her trusted legal team had already confirmed the setup. "The assets are locked, Tara. You'll only gain access if the marriage lasts for 10 years. That's the condition." Tara's jaw dropped as the implications settled in. 10 years? You can't be serious. Her voice was a mixture of disbelief and fury, but Caroline only nodded. "I prefer gold-plated boundaries," she said, her words cutting through the room like ice. "It's not just about love, Tara, it's about trust. And right now, you've done nothing to earn that trust." Marla, who had entered behind Caroline, nodded in agreement, her voice unwavering. "It's bulletproof. Paperproof." Tara stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning. She had no way of undoing it. She had no way of getting what she thought was rightfully hers. The image of control she'd worked so hard to build shattered in an instant. Caroline, however, was unshaken. She had done it. The game had changed, and Tara had been outplayed at her own game. Tara's silence spoke volumes, and as Caroline turned to leave the room, she knew that the stakes had just been raised even higher. The future had been secured, but the battle was far from over. The war for control was just beginning. The quiet hum of conversation at the brunch felt almost out of place. The elegant spread on the table, fresh pastries, delicate fruit, mimosas, stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing just a few feet away. Caroline sat at the far end of the table, her posture as impeccable as always, her hands delicately folded in front of her. She wasn't here to be part of the chatter. She was here because this was her space, her table, and she wasn't going anywhere. Dahlia sat beside her, sipping her juice, eyes observing the unfolding scene with quiet detachment. Caroline could feel the tension thickening the air. She knew what was about to happen. Tara had been simmering for days, her anger from the wedding still fresh and raw. It was inevitable. She would lash out, and Caroline would watch. She had no intention of intervening. Tara stormed into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, the echo of her fury hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Eli followed behind her, his expression tight, but Caroline could see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't yet understand the full weight of what was happening. But Tara? She knew. "I can't believe this." Tara's voice cracked as she flung herself into a chair, her hands trembling with barely contained rage. Her eyes locked on Caroline, the hate in them sharp and unwavering. "You think you have the right to control everything. My life, my marriage, everything." Caroline didn't flinch. She remained seated, her gaze focused on the delicate movements of her fingers, tracing the edge of her glass. The only sign of acknowledgement was the slight tilt of her head. Tara's chest heaved with every breath as she leaned forward, her face twisted in a mix of frustration and something darker. Desperation. Money. Control. "You've made this whole thing a battle for money. You're using it as a weapon against me." The words landed like heavy stones, but Caroline's expression remained calm. She didn't need to respond. Tara wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for someone to blame, someone to punish. Caroline was just the easiest target. Dahlia, sitting beside her, caught the moment with a quiet click of her phone, the photo capturing Caroline's serene, almost tranquil expression. It was a subtle image, the juxtaposition of Caroline's calm in the face of Tara's fury striking. Dahlia had learned long ago that Caroline always stood firm, no matter the storm. She could withstand anything, even this. The rest of the room had gone quiet, the tension thickening. People looked away, unsure if they should intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. But Caroline didn't care. She wasn't going to break. Not now. Not ever. Tara, realizing the silence had engulfed the room, pushed back from her seat, standing suddenly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Why won't you listen to me?" she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "Why can't you just accept that Eli and I love each other? Why do you have to make everything about this?" She waved her hand in the air, as if dismissing the entire situation with a single sweeping motion. Caroline still didn't move, didn't rise to the bait. She wasn't going to engage in a fight that Tara had no intention of winning. Tara was angry, scared even, and beneath all the rage was a deeper, more desperate truth. Tara had never believed she could be anything other than a shadow in this world, a world Caroline had built long before she ever entered it. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Tara was trembling now, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous, the realization that she was losing. "I deserve respect," she shouted, her voice cracking again, this time with hurt more than anger. "You think you can just make me disappear? You think you can just take everything from me and I'll take it?" Her voice wavered, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Caroline finally lifted her gaze, her eyes locking onto Tara's. It wasn't a look of sympathy. It wasn't a look of anger. It was just calm. A quiet, unflinching calm that radiated from every inch of her being. She didn't need to say anything, but she did. "Respect is only transferable when received," Caroline said softly, her voice as unshaken as the steady hand she placed on her glass. Tara's lips parted, her breath coming in uneven gasps as she tried to form a retort, but the words didn't come. The weight of Caroline's statement sank into the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, silent but forceful. Tara's pride, the very thing that had led her to believe she could control everything, was now a broken, cracked thing at her feet. And yet, Caroline knew this wasn't the end. Tara would never accept defeat without one last desperate attempt to claw her way back. But Caroline had already won. She had built this life, this family, this world. And nothing, not Tara, not her anger, not her calculated rage, would ever take that from her. Tara turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply as she stormed out of the room. Eli stood there for a moment, still lost, unsure of how to respond, but Caroline didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Dahlia's voice broke the silence as she tapped the screen of her phone. "You were right, Caroline," she said quietly. "She'll never understand." Caroline smiled, her gaze softening. She didn't need to explain herself. The game was over. The choices had been made. The legacy had been secured. And no matter how much Tara fought, she would never erase Caroline from the story. Not this time. As the door slammed shut behind Tara, Caroline's mind shifted. This was only the beginning. But in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had everything she needed. The week that followed the brunch was quieter than any Caroline could remember in months. The house, once filled with the soft echoes of distant conversation and the faint melody of piano music from the parlor, had become still, a silence that was not empty, but intentional. She had cultivated it, enforced it, carved it out of the chaos Tara had brought into her life. Peace, Caroline had decided, wasn't something that arrived politely. It had to be built, protected, and defended. She sat at her desk in her study, sunlight spilling across the dark oak surface as Marla spread a stack of legal documents before her. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and ink. Dahlia was upstairs organizing the guest rooms for the winter, and Eli was somewhere between his mother's world and his wife's, drifting aimlessly, trying to decide which one felt more like home. Caroline's eyes moved across the crisp white pages. Each line was deliberate, every clause a small fortress. The new trust arrangement wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, stewardship, and accountability. She had seen what blind generosity could do to a family. She wouldn't let her legacy be the next casualty. Marla adjusted her glasses and tapped one of the pages with a manicured finger. This clause, she said, her tone approving but cautious, will require Eli to complete marital counseling before any trust access is reinstated, even partial. You're essentially binding emotional responsibility to financial responsibility. Caroline's lips curved into the faintest smile. Exactly, she murmured. If he wants to share his life, he can start by proving he can maintain it. Marla leaned back in her chair, clearly impressed. It's innovative, she said carefully. Some might say excessive, but it's airtight. And in this family, that's saying something. Caroline looked up, her gaze steady and sharp. Peace isn't passive, Marla. It's maintained. Every generation forgets that. She took the pen from Marla's hand, signed the bottom of the page with a smooth, practiced flourish, and slid it across the desk. I'm done handing peace away for free. The door opened softly, and Eli stepped in. He looked tired, the kind of tired that lived deep behind the eyes. His suit jacket was rumpled, his hair slightly disheveled, and his expression carried that same quiet resignation Caroline had seen before, the one that always preceded compliance. Marla said you wanted to see me, he said, his voice even but guarded. Caroline gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. He hesitated for a moment, then obeyed. His fingers drummed on the armrest as he glanced at the papers in front of him. More changes? One final amendment, Caroline said calmly. Your access to the trust will require proof of participation in marital counseling, consistent attendance, verified by a professional. She folded her hands neatly, her tone neutral. It's not punishment, Eli. It's structure. It's how you learn to sustain what you've been given. Eli's jaw tightened. You're turning my marriage into a performance review. Caroline didn't blink. No, she said softly. I'm ensuring that your marriage, and your inheritance, don't crumble under the same entitlement that's already eaten through your wife's sense of reality. He looked down at the papers, his throat moving as he swallowed hard. She'll hate this, he muttered. She already hates me, Caroline replied, her voice quiet but resolute. I can live with that. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the steady tick of the mantel clock. Eli's hand hovered above the signature line. Caroline said nothing, offered no coaxing. She simply waited. Finally, he picked up the pen, sighed deeply, and signed. His name, neat, restrained, joined hers at the bottom of the page. There, he said, setting the pen down. Happy now? Caroline's eyes softened, but only slightly. No, she said, but I'm at peace with the decision. Marla gathered the papers, sliding them into a leather folio. It's done, she said. You've built something most families only dream of. Protection that will outlast every argument, every manipulation. It's bulletproof. Paperproof, Caroline corrected gently, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at her lips. When Eli left, he didn't look back. Caroline watched him disappear down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps fading until all that was left was the stillness she had fought for. Later that evening, Dahlia brought her phone to Caroline's sitting room. You should see this, she said carefully, handing it over. It was a social media post, Tara's account. A black and white photo of an empty wine glass, captioned with a single line. Sometimes the hardest prisons are built by family. Another post followed moments later. Toxic matriarchs love control more than love itself. Caroline scrolled once, then twice, before handing the phone back to Dahlia. Her expression didn't change. When people run out of leverage, she said, they post cryptic quotes. Dahlia smirked softly. Do you want me to block her? No, Caroline said. turning toward the window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in muted gold, the same color as her dress. Let her speak. Words are her only currency now. As the last light faded, Caroline picked up her glass of tea, her reflection faint in the window's darkened pane. Peace wasn't quiet submission, it was authority with boundaries. And for the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel empty, it felt earned. The quiet rhythm of Caroline's study was punctuated only by the soft tapping of her pen against the edge of the desk. The files were neatly stacked before her, each one a careful and deliberate measure of the future she was building. In these final documents, she had left nothing to chance, not her assets, not her legacy, and certainly not the people she had chosen to place her trust in. As the late afternoon sun bathed the room in a warm golden hue, Caroline sifted through the papers, reviewing the provisions she had meticulously crafted. The trust, the medical power of attorney, the travel clauses, and the legacy instructions. Every one of them was clear, precise, and uncompromising. She had spent years building everything that mattered, ensuring that her name would live on and her wishes would be honored, no matter who came and went. Her fingers moved over the names on the pages, scanning them for the final time. Dahlia was listed as the primary beneficiary for all things personal: medical decisions, legacy instructions, and anything that required the deepest trust. Jonas, ever the professional, had been named the financial executor of her estate. Eli was secondary, with his access limited and conditional, subject to the terms she had laid out. There was no mention of Tara, none at all. The omission was deliberate. Tara had not earned a place in this world, and Caroline made sure her name would never appear in any of these documents. Caroline closed the final folder, the soft click of the leather binders marking the completion of her work. The silence in the room felt heavy now, purposeful, complete. She had done what needed to be done. The door to the study creaked open and Dahlia entered, her presence a quiet comfort. She held something in her hands, wrapped in a simple, elegant frame. Caroline looked up, her gaze meeting Dahlia's, and in that moment, Dahlia knew exactly what Caroline needed. "It's ready," Dahlia said softly, placing the framed quote on Caroline's desk. It was simple, but the words spoke volumes. The gold frame caught the light from the window, casting a soft glow across the words. Gold doesn't need to speak. It just shines. Caroline studied the words for a moment, her fingers tracing the frame gently. Her expression softened, the years of fighting and planning fading as she absorbed the truth in the quote. "Exactly," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Dahlia smiled, a knowing look passing between them. The journey had been long, and there was still much ahead, but the foundation had been set. But then, just as Caroline set the framed quote aside, a sharp buzz from her phone broke the moment. It was a message from Eli. Caroline glanced at the screen, the words short and blunt. "Tara wants to talk. Says it's important." Caroline's brow furrowed. She hadn't expected this. Tara had already made her feelings clear. And there was nothing left to discuss. Still, a strange curiosity tugged at her. Why now? Why after everything that had happened? Dahlia watched her, sensing the hesitation. "You don't have to. She doesn't get to change the rules just because she's asking now." Caroline paused, her fingers hovering over the phone. The temptation to respond was there, but deep down, she knew this was no longer about Tara. This was about asserting control, about making sure Tara understood the boundaries that had been set. It wasn't just her legacy at stake. It was her peace. "I won't," Caroline said finally, her decision firm. There's nothing left to say. But as she set the phone down, the weight of it all settled back onto her shoulders. She had made her peace, but the world wasn't done testing her. Tara's sudden request for attention was just another test of boundaries, one that Caroline was determined to ignore. Dahlia's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. I think she knows she's lost, don't you? Caroline's lips curved into a small smile, her eyes never leaving the window as the light dimmed outside. She's just trying to find a way to break through, but nothing she says will matter anymore. It's done. For a moment, the two of them stood in the study, the quiet serenity of the room contrasting with the storm brewing just beyond its walls. Caroline had made her final move, and now, the peace she had created was hers alone to keep. Tara could scream, post, rage all she wanted, but nothing would ever change the truth Caroline had so carefully constructed. With one last glance at the framed quote, Caroline picked up her pen again and signed off on the final document, her hand steady, her gaze unbroken. The name that mattered was hers, and it always would be. The world might try to rewrite the story, but Caroline had written it herself. The page was already turned, and Tara? She would never get the last word. The silence in the house was oppressive, an eerie stillness that seemed to seep into every corner. Tara had been gone for days now, but it was as though her presence still lingered. The ghosts of arguments, whispered promises, and broken trust hanging in the air like a thick fog. Caroline could feel it in every moment, every passing hour that stretched between the heavy conversations with her lawyer, the delicate adjustments to her documents, and the quiet moments of reflection in her study. Eli had spent the last few days withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts, unsure of how to move forward. The tension between him and his wife had been unbearable, but now it had broken, in a way that Caroline had anticipated but had hoped would never come. She had made her peace, and now the final chapter was beginning to unfold. It came unexpectedly, the phone call in the early morning hours. Caroline sat at her desk, sipping her coffee, the warmth of the cup a contrast to the cool distance between her and the world outside. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a text message from Eli. A simple sentence. I'm leaving, Tara. It's over. For a moment, Caroline didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of his decision settled over her like a quiet, invisible storm. Eli had reached the breaking point. After everything that had happened, after all the moments of indecision, he had finally made the choice she knew he would. There was nothing more to say. A quiet sense of finality washed over her as she placed her phone down. She had done what was necessary. She had built the boundaries. And now Eli was free to navigate the mess that had been left behind. Later that morning, as Caroline sat in her study, reviewing her updated trust documents, a knock at the door broke the stillness. She knew it was Marla before she even looked up. I've updated everything, Marla said, walking in with the new pages in hand. She handed them over without preamble, the weight of the documents heavy between them. Dahlia's now listed as co-executor. She'll ensure everything is properly handled when you're no longer able to manage it. It's a smart move. Caroline glanced at the documents. The ink had dried, the final details complete. It was done. The trust was locked, and Dahlia would be the one to guide the family when Caroline wasn't there. Eli would remain in a secondary role, as he had been, but Dahlia would be the one to make the final calls. Jonas had always been the financial pillar, and now Dahlia would stand beside him, ensuring everything Caroline had built would be preserved. Thank you, Marla, Caroline said quietly, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The boundaries had been set, the legacy secured. And thank you for understanding the importance of this. Marla nodded, her expression sharp but approving. You're making sure your life's work remains intact, Caroline. I understand better than most. Caroline's thoughts drifted back to the text Eli had sent earlier. She knew this wasn't just about the separation. It was the culmination of everything that had led to this moment. The unraveling of Tara's control over Eli, the realization that she had never truly belonged in this family. Caroline had fought for Eli's future, but this final step was his own battle to win, or lose. Later that afternoon, Caroline stood by the window in the parlor, watching as Tara's car slowly pulled out of the driveway. The motion was so quiet, so deliberate, that it almost felt like a whisper. Tara was leaving, but not in a dramatic exit. No, Tara moved out in silence, as though she knew there was nothing more to fight for. Her pride had been shattered, her world turned upside down. All that remained was the knowledge that her place in this family had been erased, not by Caroline's force, but by her own failures. Caroline felt no satisfaction, no victory in Tara's departure. She wasn't that petty. But there was a deep, undeniable sense of relief that washed over her. The storm had passed, the war was over, and Caroline had won. Just then, her phone buzzed again. A message from Jonas. A quick confirmation. All accounts are still locked. She tried again, but nothing has changed. Tara's name remains nowhere on any of the documents. Caroline placed the phone down on the polished desk, her fingers lingering over the screen for just a moment longer than necessary. The pieces had fallen into place, just as she had intended. There would be no further struggle, no more manipulation. Tara had been removed from the equation, the legacy had been secured. But as Caroline turned back to the window, watching the empty space where Tara's car had been, she felt a lingering unease. Eli would have to rebuild now. Rebuild from the damage Tara had done and the space she had left behind. His future was no longer tied to her. It was entirely in his hands. The peace Caroline had enforced would now be tested by him. She stood still for a long moment, watching the horizon, knowing the battle wasn't over. Eli's journey had just begun, and it was his choice how he would navigate the world Caroline had so carefully crafted. The silence in the house felt more fragile than ever, but Caroline was prepared. This time, she knew it would last. The estate office was quiet. The only sound, the soft rustling of papers as Caroline sat behind her desk, the leather chair creaking slightly beneath her. The room was bathed in the cool afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. The walls were lined with shelves filled with family heirlooms, ledgers, and financial documents, all carefully organized. This was her kingdom, where decisions were made, where her legacy was written, and where the future of the master's family would be sealed. Dahlia entered the room with a folder in hand, her face calm, but there was an intensity behind her eyes that told Caroline everything she needed to know. Dahlia had been by her side through it all, the quiet strength that had supported her every move. Today, though, the weight of their work together was about to reach its final form. "Ready?" Dahlia asked, her voice soft but steady as she sat across from Caroline. Caroline nodded, her gaze moving to the folder Dahlia had placed on the desk. "Yes, let's review it." Dahlia opened the folder and the contents spilled out. Plans for the local arts foundation that Caroline had spent years cultivating. A legacy beyond the estate, something that would leave an indelible mark on the community, something she could give that wasn't bound by money or property but by culture, by the values that had always been at the core of the master's family. "We've made the final decisions on the grants. The artists will support," Dahlia began, her fingers moving through the papers. "The foundation will be established as a separate entity, fully independent, but with the master's name behind it. There's no mention of Tara anywhere." Her eyes flicked up to Caroline, as if checking for approval. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin smile. "Good. She doesn't deserve to be associated with it." Dahlia's nod was almost imperceptible, but Caroline could feel the quiet agreement in the air. There was no room for Tara in this world. The foundation, the arts, this legacy, it was all Caroline's. All of it would live on through the people she trusted, the people she chose. Tara had never truly understood that. They continued to review the documents, finalizing every detail, ensuring the plan was airtight. Caroline's mind raced ahead, envisioning how the foundation would grow, how it would expand, how it would become something that outlasted even her. It was an investment in something that mattered, something that could not be taken by greed or manipulation. Finally, Caroline picked up the binder labeled Master's Legacy Revised, her fingers brushing the leather cover. She opened it slowly, reverently. The binder was filled with updates to the original legacy plan, the family trust, and the provisions she had made for the future. The changes she'd made over the years, the clauses, the trusts, the investments, were now all set. She had ensured that everything was protected, every penny accounted for, every desire laid out clearly. "I think it's time," Caroline said quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. This was it. The future had been sealed, the foundation set, the legacy locked in place. It was done. Dahlia moved to the side of the room, retrieving a sleek black pen from the top of the file. She handed it to Caroline, who held it with a steady hand, her eyes never leaving the binder in front of her. Jonas appeared at the door, stepping into the office with the same calm, professional demeanor he always had. His presence was almost as solid as the family's assets themselves. He carried a final ledger with him, the financial documents that tied everything together. "I've gone over the final figures," Jonas said, his voice steady as he placed the ledger on the desk. "Everything's accounted for. Everything earned." Caroline's gaze met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something like gratitude in her eyes. Jonas had been a pillar in her world, a trusted ally who had helped guide the family's fortune. His signature on the final ledger was the last seal of approval. She signed it, her signature firm, resolute. The final piece was in place. The legacy was hers. Jonas placed his pen next to Caroline's signature, ready to add his own. As his hand hovered over the paper, he glanced at Caroline. "You've made sure there will be no questions, no challenges, no room for anything to fall apart." Caroline's smile was almost imperceptible, but it was there, quiet and unspoken. "I prefer gold-plated boundaries," she replied softly. Dahlia leaned back in her chair, her eyes softening as she took in the moment. The family, the legacy, the future. It was all now firmly in their hands. The war for control was over. There would be no more threats, no more intrusions. The storm had passed, and in its wake was the steady calm of what Caroline had built, what she had fought for. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jonas signed the final ledger. The click of the pen on paper was the sound of finality, the sound of a future protected. Tara was gone. Eli was left to figure out his own path, guided by the legacy Caroline had crafted for him. The peace Caroline had longed for, fought for, was now in her grasp. As the ink dried on the final document, Caroline looked out the window once more, the sky slowly darkening as evening approached. The world beyond the estate was changing, but within these walls everything was as it should be. And for the first time in years, Caroline felt the weight of the future lift from her shoulders. The morning was still, the air cool but not cold, as Caroline stood at the head of the long wooden table in the estate's dining room. The space was familiar, yet today it felt different, as though the weight of the past had settled here, among the gleaming silverware and the polished glassware, where light played off every surface, casting a quiet warmth that only magnified the calm. It was a small gathering, but Caroline was unbothered by its simplicity. In her mind, the smaller the circle, the more meaningful it became. There was no need for extravagance anymore. The grand gestures had all been made. Today, she was here for something else, something more intimate. Legacy. Family. Dahlia, Jonas, Eli, and Marla, the four people Caroline trusted most, were already seated, talking quietly amongst themselves. Their voices were soft, measured, as if they too sensed that today was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Caroline moved to her place at the table, her heels clicking against the floor with precision. The dress she wore, the same gold silk dress from the engagement dinner, shimmered in the light, its elegance undiminished by the passage of time. It was bold, yet soft, a statement, yet not a proclamation. Caroline didn't need to announce her presence anymore. She simply was. "Back in gold again," Dahlia remarked, the corner of her mouth lifting in a subtle smile. Caroline didn't respond at first. She only met Dahlia's eyes, her gaze unshaken. "Some things never change," Caroline said quietly, smoothing the fabric of her dress. The gold wasn't about status or spectacle. It was about remembrance. It was about ensuring she wasn't erased. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how many times Tara or anyone else tried to rewrite the story, Caroline's presence would never fade. Jonas raised his glass slightly, his usually serious face softening with a rare, approving smile. "You rewrote the whole story, Caroline," he said, his voice steady but with a note of admiration. Caroline picked up her own glass, her fingers wrapped around the stem as she looked around the table at the people she had fought so hard to protect. "No," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "I just made sure I wasn't erased from it." The silence that followed was thick with understanding. They all knew what she meant. It was the quiet force of someone who had taken control and carved out a space for herself that no one could take away. The power she wielded now wasn't in money or influence. It was in the choice to remain, to stand firm, to protect the legacy she had built. Eli's eyes flickered toward her but quickly averted as if he wasn't sure whether to engage. His expression was guarded, still working through the aftermath of his separation from Tara. Caroline knew that his journey was just beginning, and she was ready for it. He would find his own way, but for now, he was at the table. He had chosen to be here, in her space, and that was enough. The toast was simple, but its weight hung heavy in the air. Caroline raised her glass once again, her voice smooth and composed. "To legacy, to loyalty, and to legal foresight," she said, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "May we never forget what we fought for." Dahlia's voice was soft but resolute. "To family," she added, her smile warm, "and to the future we've made together." There was a brief clink of glasses, the sound resonating throughout the room like a quiet promise. The breakfast continued with light conversation. The tension that had once seemed to hang over every meal now a distant memory. Tara's absence felt almost like a relief, an unspoken acknowledgement that everything had settled where it needed to be. There were no more battles to fight. Caroline's peace was secure. But the quiet was soon broken by the soft buzz of Caroline's phone on the table. She glanced at it, but the screen remained dark. A message from an unknown number. Tara had tried to reach her once again. A small, almost imperceptible smile played at Caroline's lips as she set the phone down without responding. Tara had no more power, no more hold. There was nothing left for her to say. Dahlia, noticing the brief moment of quiet, leaned in slightly, her voice a touch conspiratorial. "I think she knows now," she said, with a knowing look. "She never stood a chance." Caroline's expression softened, but only for a moment. She glanced at her family, the people who mattered, and then back at the screen of her phone. Tara's attempt to re-enter the narrative was as futile as it had always been. The game had changed. The phone buzzed again. A new post. This time, it wasn't a cryptic quote. It was a photo. A shot of Tara at some event, looking every bit the picture of a woman still clinging to what she'd lost. The caption was simple, direct. You can't rewrite a story when the author's still here. Caroline allowed herself a single quiet laugh. Tara's desperate need for validation was apparent, but she would never get it from Caroline. Not now. Not ever. And as the conversation resumed around her, Caroline sat back in her chair, a sense of finality settling over her. My son's fiancé said I ruined the vibe of her engagement, Caroline mused softly, more to herself than anyone else. So I showed up in gold and brought the lawyer. The laughter around the table was gentle, but the truth hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Caroline had won. The legacy was secure, and nothing could erase the woman she had become.